Welcome to a special guest episode with bike reviewer Patrick Lino.
Pat's ridden and reviewed a heap of frames, everything from budget level, entry level, all the way up to the specialized Tarmac SL8, so we chat through how they all compare to each other.
He ranks his favourite wheels from 2024, including some envies that are fresh off the press. All right, let's get into it.
So I got Mr. Patrick Lino on. We wanted to chat through all the bikes you've ridden, and I want to start off from the top dog. This is really what I got you on for. How is the Tarmac SL8? So if you can remember, first ride, you swing your leg over it after coming from all these Chinese bikes and these open molds and these giant propels. How did the SL8 take you?
As soon as I rode on it, I did like a 45-mile ride. What is that for you guys? That's
80
like
Ks, yeah.
80 Ks. Yeah, as soon as I rode it, I immediately understood why people loved it. And, you know, you kind of have that cognitive dissonance where you feel like, man, I've been so conflicted not wanting to get this frame because it's so popular. And then you understand right away, like, oh, this is why it's so popular. It's, of course, just the brand cachet with it all, but it's just so comfortable to ride. I'm going to plug Mr. Grant, GC Performance, in on here because he was telling me for months of just how comfortable his was. And so it's just a very comfortable ride, but it just dynamically, it's in such a way where it's not a noodle. So I don't know what sort of magic sauce or overpriced carbon Specialized is using on the frame, but it goes. It has a lot of responsiveness to it, but it's so comfortable. It's probably the most comfortable bike I've ridden for road outside of having some sort of like 32C road tires hoops on there.
What was the actual spec of that build when you actually jumped on it for the first time? Do you remember?
Yeah, so I ride a size 56. I think I'm the same size as Jesse. I was running like a 140 millimeter SR Tarmac stem on it, carbon cockpit, of course. And then I was running my Craft Racing Works, the 5060. So those inherently are already comfortable. Not the most stable wheels on earth for crosswinds, but between the comfort of those wheels with the Tarmac is like riding on a living room couch.
The SL8's quite comfortable for you. I want to bring in some of the other name Western brands that you've ridden to the fold, and then kind of see how they stack in, I guess, below the SL8. So the interesting one, Canyon Aeroad CF SLX. We know aerodynamically it's not going to be as fast as an SL8, but what's your opinion on the ride of the Canyon Aeroad?
I enjoyed it. It felt closer to the Tavello Aero, to be honest, than it did the giant Propel or the SL8. The SL8 is the wonder bread of the frames, where it's just it's stiff, it's comfortable. The Propel, you always know that you're on it because of just maybe it's the carbon layup, the just overall geometry of it, because it has a shorter wheelbase. It always gives you the sensation that you want to go fast. The Aeroad doesn't necessarily feel like that. It feels, I would say, somewhere in the middle between the SL8 and the Propel, which is kind of how I feel about the Aero. It's a good all around feeling. Not the lightest frame for sure, but it does feel pretty bulletproof when you get going.
Do you mean, are you speaking specifically in terms of compliance, or you're also is this a ride quality where you're mixing in stiffness, pedaling stiffness, and handling stiffness too?
Correct. Yeah. And I know these days using terms like compliance usually is kind of has been sort of a red flag, but I like to use the word dynamic because, yeah, I'm accounting for how it feels over rough pavement, particularly with the rear triangle, how it feels when you are out of the saddle, you're sprinting, and then just what it feels like when you're cornering at speed. And so that Aeroad is a good balance.
Yeah, I don't think that's, I think it's important to try and split between those. Like if I kind of ask you if we're speaking in terms of, if you just say the ride quality of the Canyon Aero, it doesn't really mean that much. I think saying compliance, in terms of you spec it with the same tires and the same wheels, how much does it beat you up? That's perfectly valid metric to discuss a bike on.
Good question. So in that respects, then the Aeroad, it's more forgiving than the Propel is for sure. And I would say it's probably middle of the road. And then with, of course, the the SL8 being the most compliant out of those mainstream brands, the Propel probably No, not probably. It is the worst. It's the worst out of the ones I've tested.
That's interesting. So Propel versus Aeroad is probably a similar type of rider and buyer that would be shopping between those two.
Not a massive price difference either, I wouldn't have thought.
Yeah.
In the same sort of space.
Yep. And so you're saying that the Propel is noticeably not as comfortable. Do you have any stats on the weight difference between those two?
I don't, because the Propel, you can buy it as a frame set alone option. In the Canyon Aeroad, you can't. But if I were to guess just frame by frame, because the Propel is probably somewhere like, I don't know, it might be like 1050, maybe 1100 grams. So that Aeroad has to be sitting at somewhere probably like 1250 grams.
That was the CLX, the SF, no, it was the SLX, yes.
Yeah, so basically the equivalent of my Propel and the Tarmac Pro, the mid-tier frame.
What about the stiffness in the bottom bracket and the head tube for those? Anything noticeable? It's fine if you couldn't really tell between the Aeroad and the Propel.
I really couldn't tell too much of a difference, even running the similar wheels. But I would probably give the victory to the Propel. And I think part of it is because the bottom bracket on the Propel, from what I've ridden it feels just as stiff as the Aeroad. However, because it just feels marginally lighter and more nimble, it feels like it's more responsive, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yep. So I'm just looking up what was the Propel in the Tour magazine aero testing was 209 watts. And the Aeroad is 203, I think. That's a significant gap between those two. Are we on the same page here? So let's say you were that buyer that's, wants the aero bike and is shopping between a Propel and an Aeroad. Where are you landing then overall between those two bikes?
Are we making the assumption that I can get a frame set only option for the Aeroad?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, there's another.
Yeah, because I just quick anecdote. I was riding back from Akuna Bay on the weekend and ended up riding next to someone who just bought this literal bike, and he was
the
in
Giant or the
no
Canyon?
the Canyon.
Okay.
The white one looked beautiful. I think yours is a white one as well. Oh no, yours was the sort of silvery one, wasn't it? Yeah, but this was the white one. Looked beautiful. He was a little bit in between sizes, but he's got the Jesse Coyle hated wheels on there with the 21 mil rim internal DT Swiss. But the big stitch up for him was because he had to buy a size small. It came with a 90 mil stem, and I'm looking at his bike fit. Sorry, I think his name was James. He's like, oh, do you think the bike's a bit small for me? And I kind of riding next to him going, well, yes, it is, but I don't want to say that because it's literally your new bike day. But he was in that same position where now he has to do this thing where you can buy the extra one for $450, but then you're stuck with this 90 mil stem thing. So that's a legit fair thing to say, Pat, that, what am I getting here? Do I have to get the package or not?
I do want to speak with Pat about custom build versus stock package. So I don't want to go, let's save that one because that is a great point. But just in terms of the actual frame dynamics,
sure.
How are you tossing coins between Propel and Aeroad?
I would go Aeroad. I on a day-to-day basis, day in and day out, for all things, the Aero is more palatable, I'm gonna say, and for most consumers, they're gonna probably side that way as well, because the Propel, just of how stiff it is and the way it's set up, you have to be a very particular rider to appreciate that, irrespective of whether or not you race. But the Aero does those things pretty well, and like you said, if we're talking, what is it, 6 or 7 watt difference, if that's important to you, then that might just be the swing vote. For myself, I didn't know that data point.
Is that comfort or lack of compliance on the Propel an issue now with wider tires, or is that just part of the total ride package? It's just like, I can feel a few more bumps. It feels stiffer, but it's not really a negative. Or is that no? I don't. Not really looking forward to doing 3 hours on this thing.
It's so when I first got into the YouTube space, so at this point I've had two AliExpress or AliExpress, LA Sprints rather. We'll talk about AliExpress frames later. That's how you can tell I'm knee deep in the Chinese frame business. So I've had two LA Sprint frames, and I've just gotten so accustomed to that feeling that when I don't have that feeling, my first initial reaction is, oh, this is a noodle, even if you are going whatever prescribed speed when you look down at your computer. So I've always just gotten used to that sort of feeling. And it wasn't until I got to the Propel where I was like, oh, yeah, this feels similar to the Sprint, except it's just significantly lighter. And, I've kind of started my trend of being able to benchmark more of these premium bikes. So I don't particularly like wide tires, which we can get into later. I like that feeling of just being able to know what's happening with my wheels and tires at all times.
You're a TPU man, aren't you? You're not a tubeless
100%.
man. We're
Absolutely.
Gonna have issues there.
Yeah.
We're gonna have issues.
So for you then, the compliance of the frame is probably more important than, let's say, for Chris, because Chris is running 30 or 32s tubeless at 50 psi. Would you agree?
Right.
Or not?
Yeah,
not
I would agree with that.
Okay, I'm starting. I'm getting a feel for it here. Now we've got a long list of bikes to get through, so I want to let's snake our way. So, if we start to drop down the price ladder, the interesting one you hit is the Winspace T1500. Now we've got an idea of what you think of the SL8, the Aeroad, and the Propel. Where's the T1500 from Winspace sliding in here?
The T1500 has similar levels of compliance or lack thereof of the Propel. However, it is more sensitive to being upset on that rear end when you start to get over rough pavements. So if you're cornering, even if you're not necessarily bombing into an apex, you have to be a little bit more mindful with where you're going, because that back end will get kind of wild on you. And I've noticed, just as a whole, that's one of the things that the Chinese brands, for the most part, have not been able to figure out, as opposed to the Western brands.
I was going to say, it sounds like what the feeling of the Devel was that we were riding on the team a few years ago.
That's the classic dog feeling, isn't it?
You're going down to descent, you turn a corner, there's a few bumps, and you just go,
you just start to lose it.
Oh, felt that. Oh, felt that.
Interesting. Yeah. I haven't heard it articulated that well. Interesting. Okay. That was the Winspace, which, to be fair, is a 2020. It's probably a generation old. Would that be fair to say?
It's like 5 years old at this point.
Okay.
I mean, they did that mini update because now there's the T1550, and then they released a totally new bike called the Winspace Agile, which is the main selling point. What is more comfort, and so it seems like they've tried to address that. But that's, like, to me, in a frame, unless you're only racing hot mix 45-minute crits, that really stiff back end it really results in a unenjoyable ride experience. No one really wants to do 3 hours or 4 hours on a bike like that. That's why it's getting off that was so good.
I think for myself too, is because I'm kind of going into this, either going into this the right way, where I'm marginally upgrading every season these frames, or I'm just completely losing my mind, because the more I talk to folks online, the more I realize, oh, you don't have to put up with some of the harshness of some of these frames. I've just gone into it thinking, oh, this is pretty normal. These feelings, come to find out later that, oh no, that if you're going straight to the Western brands and you hop on one of these older generation Chinese bikes, you're like, oof, I don't think so.
What about the Polygon Helios then? That's an interesting one. So, like an Asian frame, but through a well-known brand, which is crazy high value. So a very cheap bike, often sold as, well, look, the spec you're getting, even if the frame's not that good, you're still coming off in the positive because the price is so cheap. So how does that frame actually ride? Because there's a Continental team on it.
Yeah, so now that I've set it up in a way that works for me because, like similar to the Canyon Aeroad, if the geometry or just the overall fit doesn't work for you out of the box, that means you're having to now invest in new components to make it work. So for my case, so for that geometry, the way it's kind of set up is I probably should have gone up to a larger frame size for the reach, but then the stack I just would not be able to get the stack low enough. So what I did was for that 56, I ended up getting a set of Tavello bars. It was like 140 length on that, 36 with bars on it. And then of course, upgraded the wheels and stuff. And I would say it feels similar to the Winspace, probably just marginally more compliant. But it definitely does not feel like you're riding a cheap bike. Like it doesn't feel like the savings went into the frame itself. So I'm looking at kind of everything in sort of a whole entire package rather than just in a vacuum.
Because you got that down to like 7.2 without pedals, didn't you?
Yeah, so it's a fine bike. I think Bikes Online, I think they kind of understand who this bike is for, and for someone, especially like say for you guys, where you're not going to be buying a complete bike like that, and that you're going to have to do some pretty major upgrades to make it worth your time.
Hmm. But so you're of the opinion that for an average rider, taking the time to upgrade that frame is actually still worth it. It's not like you're just dressing up a pig or whatever that saying is.
No, that's a fantastic question. Yeah, absolutely. And so my argument in my video was that Vision Metron cockpit. I mean, it comes with like a 42 centimeter width, which is so obsolete these days, in my opinion. But you should be able to get a few $100 for that. The wheels can be your winter training wheels. Still comes with Di2 group set. So really, at the very least, I would say at least swap out that cockpit, get a different saddle on there, and you should be pretty solid. And then maybe save up money later for a set of wheels if you don't want to drop $1,000 USD for some wheels.
To split between the T1500 from Winspace and the Polygon Helios. Am I right in saying you preferred the Polygon Helios?
Yes. I have not thought about this question until right this moment. I would prefer the Polygon over the Winspace just by hair, just simply because that back end again is a little bit more comfortable to ride for longer distances.
That's sort of my sort of thing was like, of the next generation of Chinese bikes, if we're saying that Winspace is the first generation, of the next generation, like, okay, we're probably talking about the Tavello.
So with the Aero, and for all I know, it could be a placebo effect, but the way just the geometry just works for me. Now, again, I'm not using the same handlebars on it, but the Aero feels just like an evolution of that attack frame. Where again, it doesn't beat you up, of course. It feels plenty fast, but there's just some sort of intangible about it that it just feels more premium than that Tavello Aero frame.
That's interesting. Okay. Yeah. So if you take the Tavello Aero then, what are you putting that alongside in terms of the bike frames that we've already talked about?
That's definitely of all the ones I've reviewed, that definitely is S tier of the Chinese bikes, no question.
But it's not.
Is it a Propel? Is it a Propel? That's the question. Ultimately, does it ride like a Propel? Does it reach that level?
Gun to my head today and said, "Hey, you can only ride one of these for eternity." I'm taking the Propel.
Yeah.
Hold on, but you picked the Propel over the Aeroad. Sorry, you picked the Aeroad over the... No, you didn't pick the Aeroad. You thought the Aeroad was a better bike for someone else. But you personally prefer the Propel.
I personally like the Propel. The issue I'm having, which is unfortunately just being a YouTuber, right, where, you're constantly reviewing out frames, and it does get to a point where it's almost redundant to the point, I got to kind of keep it moving with newer frames. And so that's just the one on the chopping block.
If you had to put... So I just think the Tavello comparison is really interesting between the two versions of the bike, because one is you've ridden both generations of it. Is there a take apart from, is it just the geometry that you think is that they've improved from the arrow to the attack. Sorry, from the attack to the arrow. God, that's confusing. Or is there a little tagline that you can use that this newer generation have?
The arrow from the previous attack frame, what I've noticed is number one is the arrow is lighter, despite the fact of me basically going a frame size up. It's marginally stiffer in the bottom bracket area, and it's more communicative out on the road. So we're talking this is separate from compliance, but we're talking about actual feedback and what your tires are doing. Where with the previous attack frame, it just felt a little bit dead, where, you're riding along and you're just like, okay, it's a fine bike, but it doesn't really do anything for you. So I think just all those small improvements, and I don't think that Tavelo is using a higher grade of carbon, at least not from the spec sheet. But it looks like there were more considerations, at least to the bottom bracket area, and then just kind of setting up that design a little bit more to be more racy feeling.
Mm-hmm. So you between the Propel and the Arrow, you're going with the Propel because it's stiffer and just feels faster. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I just like that excitement that it gives.
Okay. This is satisfying my own personal curiosity, but if you threw then the Arrow against a bike that is more compliant, which you personally probably don't like how would you compare an Arrow to the SL8, for example?
Now, we're talking just specifically just how the frame rides. We're not talking about warranty, customer support, brand cachet, any of that stuff.
Yeah. Just in terms of, weight, stiffness, compliance, cornering, that kind of thing. Just the pure ride dynamics. Essentially, what am I missing out on?
Yeah. He has you have a Tavelo, you see someone ride past with an S-Works SL8, and you're like, fuck, wish I had that. But why? Apart from the brand.
I mean, I don't think that, but I'm just saying hypothetically.
Yeah, hypothetically. No, you're looking at them going, why?
No.
Anyway, yeah.
No, if there was a bike that I get that on, I'm looking at someone go past on an Aeroad, and I'm probably going, yeah, that'd be a bit faster.
Yeah, it's like these smaller differences, like the difference of one feeling like a cruiser, one feeling like a Porsche GT that has all the interior removed out of it. That's like the Propel. Then the SL8 is kind of like it's not quite gutted out, track car, but it's just light enough to where it's very tangible. So I would say, as far as comfort goes, the top two being the SL8, and then just right beneath it is that Tavelo, bottom being the giant Propel. Now, as far as compliance, same thing. The Propel is also at the bottom of that as well. Middle ground would be the Tavelo, tarmac being the top. Now, as far as excitement goes to ride, I would say the Tavelo is just slightly more exciting to ride than that SL8. Because of just how comfortable the SL8 is. It's kind of one of those, it's very difficult to have both of those, right? Because what I translate excitement to is, what are my wheels doing? How does it feel into a corner? Doesn't mean that it's uncontrolled. It's just, hey, there's a lot of feedback going on here, and I like the way that feels. I don't want the frame to be so comfortable where it's just destroying any feedback on the road, especially when you get going. But I'll end it by saying, from the consumer and the questions I get, the Propel would be pretty difficult of a frame to recommend to your average consumer, because more times than not, they're going to say, oof, it's going to be too stiff. Unless you're someone who isn't a racer or an enthusiast type of cyclist.
That's always been the criticism of the Propel. Like, for years, generations of it. It's been, Jesus, bulletproof, this thing. It's like a bloody, which is probably why the TCR still exists, because it's completely the opposite. It's like the ride. I think you'd probably quite appreciate the ride quality of a TCR.
I've been looking at that frame. The geometry is the same. Now, where it gets interesting is, so even though in Chicago it's fairly flat, once you get about 2 hours outside of the city, out into the country roads, you can easily get, I would say, 2,000 to 3,000 meters of climbing in a 100K ride. So That's where it gets interesting because the SL8, of course, is the best climber. The Propel is very close behind. Like, I love the way that thing climbs because it is so stiff. And then the Tavello and then the Winspace is towards the, towards the bottom of that list for climbing.
And is that just a pure weight thing for you, or do you feel the balance of the bike's a bit different from a climbing perspective?
The balance is a big part of it. Completely separate from descending, but just the way it feels out of the saddle when you're sort of dancing out of the climb, you just feel more connected with that SL8 and the Propel than I did with my T1500. And yeah, I don't know if it's just the weight thing or if the aerodynamics actually matters at, whatever slower speeds you're going. But that's one area where it seems like the Western brands definitely shines is on the climbing, which again would make another argument for that TCR frame set.
That was always the criticism of the first set of generation of all the disc brake bikes. And that's certainly one thing I feel like, when you pick a bike up and you pick it up to test the weight and it just felt unbalanced, like all the weight was in the back end of it. And I the first bike that I've picked up that didn't do that was that Factor Ostro Vam, which seemed to be a more balanced disc brake bike. I wonder whether that's just, we haven't quite got to that phase yet with the Chinese ones.
With the Aeroad also being low on that list too.
I find it, it's very interesting to clearly it's very difficult to really to nail down what's in your head about how the bikes ride in different scenarios. Like when your way of explaining it, you have to resort to car analogies because there isn't really a word that nails down the ride feel. I think it's interesting. Not quite as simple as ABC in your ranking.
I have a question for you guys before we move on. Of course, just splice this up wherever it makes sense, if it makes sense. But in the notes I had was a question for you guys of the racers, the recreational riders, and the enthusiasts, and basically how they review the frames, right? Because for someone like myself, I kind of teeter-totter that line, but I try not to overstep that line of talking about frames in such a way like, oh, this would be fantastic for racing, because for you guys, it becomes a very difficult thing to listen to someone who's trying to tell you that this is a great race bike if he doesn't really race. But then you also have folks who do ride their bikes a lot, and even if they're not pushing it 9/10 all the time, there are opportunities where they can kind of understand, oh, this is where the differences are. So for you guys, what does that look like? Does that matter to you for context when you're watching a review?
My thing is, I find that it's difficult to get information about how different frames ride in what you want to hear about. Like if you just say compliance, I want to know how compliant the new Trek Madone is. It's very difficult to find that. And then also you layer in, if someone talks about it, it's their personal opinion compared to what's the baseline. So just getting the information is one problem, but I feel what is another problem is a lot of riders don't really know what they should be looking for in the frame they want. I mean, I feel like I know what characteristics I want for the riding and the racing I'm doing, but we see it all the time. There'll be someone that's doing like a third or fourth level club rides, and all they're looking at is aero results, or an ex-pro who's now doing elite racing. They've been racing for 15 years, and all they're looking at is the frame weight. They think low light is better. So I think that's a problem. I think a lot of people don't really know what variables to look at when they're shopping for a new bike. And even if they do know, it's quite difficult to find it.
The SL8, I've seen reviews online of people saying just how stiff the front end is on the SL8. I haven't felt that. I have not felt that myself. Again, it's not saying it's a noodle. I know again, going back to Grant, he says how comfortable it is. Excuse me. But just the way people will say online is just how stiff that front end, and it just I'm like, well, you haven't ridden a giant Propel because let me tell you, it's quite comfort. Comfort is the first word that comes to my mind, not stiff, you know, dive bombing into a corner.
Which is a good thing, might I add.
Yes.
Most people don't need a stiffer, less compliant bike. They need a more comfortable one. It's interesting. Is there any other common talking points about bikes or reviews that you've seen where you've just gone, am I riding a different bike? Don't feel it. That was a really good example. Is there any others?
The Tantan. So shout out to Tantan, because I think that was my bike build that got me first featured on your show, which I appreciate. But I didn't.
That was a Scott Foyle lookalike, wasn't it?
Correct. This is a whole nother topic because Tantan has been on a roll with plenty of tribute designs, as we'll call it.
Inspired by us.
Yeah. But I didn't enjoy the way that frame rode at all. It was pretty sloppy. Like, it looks cool. It's fine for a coffee bike, I suppose, but it was probably one of the more sloppier frames that I rode. And just on some of the forums I've been on, I got a lot of pushback of people basically saying, I disagree. And, they're, of course, within their rights to have their opinions on it. But that frame just felt very sloppy. And it immediately felt like it was a race to just get the design down. And that was it.
Sloppy in what way? Stiffness? What do you mean by sloppy?
So it was stiff enough in the bottom bracket area, but then so stiff on the back end where it was just not planted at all. And you didn't even have to really be going that fast. And particularly where I live, where we have 4 seasons, right? The roads are crappy. So, leaving out of my house, the first 40 minutes is just crappy roads. So right away. And at this point, I was running 28 C tires with latex tubes that plumped up to like 31. Right. So it should be a pretty comfortable ride. And even then, it still felt like it was just stiff in all the wrong areas. You're stiff in the bottom bracket, but too stiff rather in that rear triangle where handling was very questionable.
Look at that frame though, Jesse. Like that, you don't need to ride that to know that is going to absolutely smash you to pieces. Like, there is no vibration dampening happening.
But it's interesting because the actual Scott Foyle from NorCal's review, he was saying it's significantly more comfortable than the T1500 from Winspace.
Because it's a mainstream bike,
clearly
mate.
there is clearly a way to do the layup in a way that absorbs some of that, which Tantan have totally avoided.
Jesse, going back to your question earlier about just if there's any other talking points. So what I've noticed is some of these frames too, even with the Western brands, is they feel better the faster you go, which sounds like fairy dust, but it's a very tangible thing. So if you're putting around town on that Propel, it's like, I don't want to do this for 6 hours. But once you're getting up to that 27, 28, it feels locked in. Definitely feels locked in.
100%. 100%. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. There's I call it like a 32, 33 kilometer an hour threshold for the bikes. And anything under it, you're like, ugh, don't really want to be here.
That's part of the problem. Someone will probably buy a Propel because Patrick Lino said it's really stable at high speeds, and this person averages 26.1 kilometers an hour. And probably sees 40 plus kilometers an hour for a few seconds on a downhill. And therein lies the problem of a review or of a consumer.
Yeah, basically. Well, yeah. I mean, my piece on this, like that I don't think people ride the aero bike the way it should be ridden, in the sense that when you are on a slight drag uphill, you just put out consistent power, and then you continue to put that power as you crest over the hill, and you start coming down the other side, and you keep putting out consistent power. That's where an aero bike is a friggin' rocket ship. And I argue most people still ride an aero bike like, I'm on a hill. Go nuts.
But most people should buy a bike to suit their riding, buy an S5 and then go, oh, I need to change how I approach every ride and all my rides with my friends because Chris convinced me to buy an aero bike. It's totally the wrong way around the circle. Anyway. Yeah, so the open, sorry, it shouldn't say open mode, should it? Just the Tans, the absolute, the real budget level. You've explained it there with the X38, but I saw another one pop up recently, the TTX67. It's kind of like a Seeker Spear at the back end and then a very aero-looking front end. Almost looks like a Propel down tube, but then with a much deeper fork. And so I'm looking at this, Pat, and I'm going, interesting. Very nice looking. Why is, in your experience, where's this probably going to be lacking? Is it weight? Is this thing going to weigh 2 kilos? What's the go here?
If you are an investor, how do you determine future trends? By looking at previous trends. Mm-hmm. So there isn't anything about that to make me believe they magically got it right, other than the visuals on it.
Sorry, the frame weighs 923.8 grams.
What's it called? Sorry,
just Google TTX67.
Oh wow!
So yeah, I mean, just look at that, and you're going, looks like a 2024, 2025 aero bike.
Yeah.
For these brands at this particular price point, that's, in my opinion, that's just not where they should really be marketing themselves. In classic designs, maybe a little bit of designs where you can see they took some inspiration, but something like that, I don't see why someone who says, hey, I only have $600 to spend on a frame, I just need something that's going to get me going. I can do my group rides, maybe, push it a little bit. I just don't know why anyone would buy the frame, because it's pretty striking. But the question that's not being asked is, what's the expectation in that design? Is it going to be faster? Is it going to be more stable in crosswinds? It's light, but light doesn't mean the budget frames, they don't do well with the lighter frames, right? It's what is it? Stiffness, price, weight, right? You can probably have 2 of those, but you're not going to have all 3. So I can't imagine it being super stiff for sub 1,000 grams.
Oh, you commented on the Instagram post.
Well, that's just me being Instagram whore. I have to make sure the connection is still there, and maybe they could say, hey, we want to send you this out. Now all bets are off at that point. But
yeah, I know. I think it's before its time, that thing.
Yeah.
But
isn't that how a Western brand starts? Their bikes start as a drawing from some product manager, really. And then it's a process of, well, how do we actually make this a good bike? So it just seems like potentially Tan do that bit, and then they kind of skip the middle of it, and then suddenly there's a mold and there's a frame you can buy. But they've missed the actual production of a good frame. And so, but in doing that, what was it saying Joe had? 1,000 different monkeys, and maybe one day they come up with one that's actually good. But yeah, I would be holding my breath.
Yeah, a broken clock is wrong, or was it right twice a day?
Do you have any insight as to what are they missing? Do they just use too much carbon, or is it the wrong the type of carbon in the wrong areas? Why does this just ride so differently than a?
Yeah, if I were to guess, I suspect it's too much carbon in the wrong areas, and I understand the logic behind it, because you figure if a good portion of their customers is Western and European side of the world, the warranty support is just not going to be great, right? It's a cheap frame. So their sort of built-in insurance policy is to, let's just try to make this more bulletproof rather than a noodle. And with that, they're just adding more carbon. Maybe they're using a cheaper grade, which is, albeit, heavier grade of carbon. So they're more focused on it being a robust frame, not necessarily a dynamically enjoyable frame.
All right, let's just pause for a moment, guys, for a quick word from today's show partner, Cache.cc. Now, if you have been living under a rock for the last few weeks, we have been diving into the Cache website. They're an online retailer here in Australia who do ship globally. Jesse, they're doing some sales at the moment. What are you seeing?
Look, I don't know how long this sale is going to go for, but it's their Boxing Day sale. 10% off store-wide using code BOX10 at checkout. And why store-wide? I mean store-wide. I just put a Factor Austro VAM in my cart and it gave me $1,500 off. So get on there now. It appears like that code is for site-wide, everything, including full-price bikes, including items that were already on sale. I had a Cannondale Cargo e-bike in my cart that was already $1,300 off. Box 10 took another $600 off the price. So that's just clearly the biggest thing to shout out is you're getting 10% off anything. Insane.
The other one I wanted to quickly mention is the Burr bar tape, B-U-R-G-H bar tape. That, like in the level of sort of Sydney froth items on your bike, that's quite high up there amongst those that know, I'm told. Jesse, they have it in stock, $52. They've actually got a couple of limited edition ones they do. So they do like, almost like collaboration type bar tapes, which I think is a cool little like style factor that you can add to your bike. So they're doing one at the moment, Cache collaborating with NSTRMO, and it's about $52. So throw your 10% discount in, then you're getting that under $50. I should also mention that they are holding up their shipping over this particular period. So the little elves are in there packaging up your bar tape and sending it out, which is pretty cool.
GP5000 update. For those following along at home, all sold out, every size. You can't get a tubeless GP5000 from Cache at the moment. Go add your name to the waitlist when they come back in stock. You'll be the first ones able to order them in the coveted 30mm width.
You're such a professional at ad reads. You're highlighting products that you can't get at the place that we're advertising. Anyway, yeah, just jump on that feature, the notify me when back in stock. Because
the other one is the replaceable part. So the chains are already on sale, the cassettes are already on sale, plus 10% off. And so if you know you're going to be cranking out 15,000, 20,000 miles next year, you can stock up.
To do that, guys, use the special link down in the description below. It helps out the show. A massive shout to Cache for supporting today's episode. And back to the chat with Pat. All right, I think more than frames, Pat, I think wheels have been the absolute staple on the channel. And this fascinates me because there's like a new wheel brand we're seeing almost every couple of weeks, and most of them seem to be ending up in your hands. So we haven't listed them out, but I'd love to hear I don't know whether you want to give us a list of sort of top to bottom or just a little run through of what you've experienced and what you're seeing.
I haven't said this yet in the video because it's going to be coming out probably in the coming weeks, but I did get the opportunity to test out the new Envy wheels. And
the UAE Pogacar ones? What ones did you test?
The 4.5s. So what is it, like 50, 58?
Mm-hmm. But you couldn't have run them with tubes because they're hookless.
Right. So I had to run GP5000 tubeless tires with tubes.
Oh my God, Patrick!
Jesus, just bloody.
I'm not.
That's awful. Oh no.
The wheels were on loan. I'm not going to fill it up with a whole bunch of sealant jizz and then have to clean it off and then have to return them to the bike. I'm not doing all that. You know, what are we doing? What are we doing here? So,
aren't they designed to be run tubeless though? Anyway, sorry, I'll let it go.
But tubeless tires with a tube are notoriously they don't ride well because they're not intended to have another layer of tube. The tires are thicker.
I love them. I'm not going to lie. Like, hookless aside, if I won the lottery tomorrow, and again, it sounds anecdotal and I don't know what magic sauce they're doing, but if I won the lottery tomorrow and I was like, hey, I could drop $3,000 on a set of wheels, it would probably be those. It doesn't make any sense at all because they're hookless. They're like 1,500 grams, and at this point, we're in the sub 1,300 gram for wheels now.
Oh, look, Chris is getting excited. Look at him.
Heavier is better. Yes. Heavier is better. You heard it here first.
There's something about them that feels so bulletproof. And again, where I live at, the roads are crappy, but plowing over rough roads and you feel like, oh, these are not gonna break. there's just that feeling you have where you know, and I don't like to use that word confidence inspiring, but there definitely is a level of confidence to them where you're like, man, like these are going to last forever. It's just that they're $3,000 and they're hookless.
It's interesting because in your wheel videos, you quite often bring up that sheet with all the wheel sets you've tested and then the weights that they are. And so naturally, anything in a list, the top of the list is better. But your wheel set you would buy is probably in the bottom quarter of that list of weight.
Because so just quickly, the specs on that they're 4.5s, but that's not actually the rim depth, is it? No.
It's not, no.
What are the specs?
So it's 58 in the rear, 50 in the front. Internal is like 25.
Mm-hmm.
External is 32. Steel spokes, 62 star ratchet hub. So if you like those kind of things, they sound fantastic, and they handle exceptionally well in the crosswinds, which at my weight, I'm like 75 kilograms. 50, 58 is not really budging me, but they just do all these things really well, and they just feel very firm, but not just outwardly stiff, especially for a steel spoked wheel like that.
Because that's exactly right. Like if you just read those specs out on one of your videos, it'd be right down the bottom end of the ranking in terms of what it's delivering.
Yeah, and knock on wood, I've never had to service a set of wheels, probably because I'm constantly swapping them out. But there's local dealer support near me, so their turnaround time is 1 week. If you break a spoke, they're there to support you. It's lifetime warranty. So all these things. And again, I'm sure people who are racing on these are probably sponsored, so it's not really an issue for them. But if you are a paying customer and you want to be a freedom fighter and you want to support American brand, I mean, I can't see myself looking at any other American wheel brand. I don't really care for what's the other American wheel brand?
Well, you got Zip. Really? Aren't they US?
Zip? Yeah. No.
Yeah, so talk to me.
No.
So let's go on to some of your other mainstream ones then.
Sure.
So you've ridden the Firecrests?
So I've ridden the Firecrest. So I've ridden the 404. Those felt pretty boring to ride. I didn't really care too much for that. And those actually felt heavy in a way that somehow the modern Envies do not. I've also ridden the 303S Zips.
So they're like the cheapish
I like
ones?
Those. Yeah, I enjoy those. I would actually invest in those myself because I think the price point is good. And for people coming to me asking for a wheel and they're like, I don't want to deal with a Chinese brand, that's usually the one that I recommend. And you can run them for gravel. They're a really versatile set of wheels. So I like them. I've ridden the old Envy, like the 6.7s, where they were still using was it 18 millimeter internal, which sounds so obsolete. Quick side note, I remember when the Pros Closet was around the first time, they were constantly reselling those wheels, and they still wanted like $2,300 for those, and they were so obsolete in their specs. I'm like, who is buying that? There's no way. Maybe for like $1,200. I'm trying to think of some other mainstream brands.
You never read the Cadex ones, did you, on the Propels or any of the Giants?
I have not. Those are so wickedly expensive. It's and there's no dealers around here who would even let me borrow a set of those wheels.
Rovals?
I'm just looking at my list. No Rovals yet. Those are ones are on my list at some point because I'm curious to see how those ride compared to the craft racing 5060.
Okay, I've got one for you. So we're talking about the MV SES 4.5s, and so if we go for the Chinese competitor, that also has steel spokes at a similar depth, slightly deeper. So the Yolio C60 Pro SL2s, they're quite a bit lighter. So they're 1,372 grams for a pair, but with steel spokes, and they're slightly deeper than the MVs. Just off a spec sheet read, the Yolios are more impressive. What's the comparison between those two?
The comparison with those two is the Yolios feel just slightly easier to accelerate. but just how it handles bumps, it's not as great as the Envies. Now, again, that could just be because those Envies are slightly heavier and they're just kind of bombing through bumps versus the Yolios are kind of just floating over the top of them. But they just feel more of a solid wheel. Um, and that's one thing I've kind of noticed too with these lighter, deeper depth wheels is sure they're light, they're easy to accelerate, but when you start getting over bumps and stuff, there's always that kind of little like, oof, is this gonna break? Or if you're 100 kilometers, I'm sorry, 100 kilograms rather, is it going to support me? So I've never had any catastrophic failures. I do want to make that clear. A thud versus a hollow noise when you go over bump, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Mm.
From a performance perspective, fuck it, we'll go there now. The carbon spoke stuff. From a performance perspective, I think we can all agree that they're lighter, so they are going to have that snappier, more acceleration. But you just sort of referred to it then, the planted feeling. But what about from a performance perspective? Because my limited experience with them so far has been once you do get up to speed, let's say plus 35 kilometers an hour, they don't feel as aerodynamic. That there's some sort of, I don't know whether it's the thick bladed spokes. It's just a pure ride feel for me that they don't seem to, quote unquote, hold their speed like a steel spoke would. Have you had any experience with that? Does that make any sense to you?
I've had the opposite experience
Okay.
with it, where when you are in a scenario where you're having repeated accelerations happening, I've noticed similar to how with your S5, Chris, it's once the pace starts to get spicy, you feel more planted. To me, that's where the carbon spokes start to come alive.
Interesting.
And that's when I started to notice that after repeated accelerations, the snappiness starts to come alive. You're not going to notice it if you're going, 18 miles an hour, 25K an hour.
As in you're at 35 kilometers an hour and you're trying to bridge a gap. You mean
Correct.
the acceleration once you're already at speed, you notice it.
Correct.
Not just
Correct.
like humming along and like in a time trial.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So, if you're at a traffic light at a standstill, you would be hard pressed to really tell the difference between those two. But as soon as you start accelerating at those higher speeds, and especially if you are climbing out of the saddle on a hill, you can definitely, I can tell the difference. I can tell the difference between the carbon and the steel. Now, the comfort is also different too. And as you can imagine, the steel spokes being inherently more comfortable. The Oleo ones are the ones that are kind of interesting, and probably part of that is because I think they're using 24 spokes, both front and rear, as opposed to the 24 rear, was it 20 front? So they are pretty stiff. Again, they're also 60 mil deep too, so they're going to inherently be more stiffer than like a 45 depth wheel too. But those are the only ones where they've seemed to have kind of broken that usual expectations that you would get with a steel spoke.
So did you think the MVs were quite comfortable, compliant?
Not using my own scale for comfort.
If we're let me make it easier. Let me bring up another wheel set just so we're always doing comparisons and not generalization. So compared to the CRWs, the 5060s, which are a good bit lighter, but they have carbon spokes.
So for comfort at a deeper depth, I would say that the crafts are probably the benchmark in this conversation or this particular segment right now. The Envies are not as comfortable, but they're not harsh.
Okay.
If that makes sense. So for comparison, like the first generation of the Winspace Hypers, and again, I'm someone who's used to just constantly getting punished around on these, alloy frames. So those are very, very stiff. Not going to always feel planted until you kind of really get going. But for the average consumer, they would probably say they were too stiff.
Yeah, I had the Wins on my giant TCR. I had the Winspace 35 mil deep rim brake ones, and they were just so stiff and had no compliance. It was really awful ride experience. I didn't like them at all.
I do want to say, and I don't know if just now that I'm starting to just better understand, like you said earlier, Jesse, what I'm looking for when I'm doing these reviews. But now that I've kind of come full circle back to steel spokes, I've started to really appreciate steel spokes at my tender age of 41. And just the versatility of it. I mean, obviously, I'm very fortunate to be able to try out different wheels. But if you are someone that only has one or two sets of wheels and you need them to be versatile, the Chinese steel spoked wheels now, they're all really, really good now. So you don't need carbon spokes the way I would say probably like 3 years ago, because I had these earlier sets of machine steel wheels. They were like 58 mil deep. They were pretty comfortable, but they didn't feel like they'd be stiff enough to kind of really get the party started. And now steel spokes from like particularly Olio, I'm like, oh, these are plenty good enough to handle all the abuse you would expect.
That's really disappointing. I was hoping to have an argument with you about carbon spokes and steel spokes. How disappointing. Well, okay, here's one then. So I think you rode the Machine XR, geez, their naming conventions are just deplorable. Machine XR DB607 Ultra wheels. And I would argue, so they're almost like the poster child of the Chinese Aero wheel, really. Carbon spoked, wide rim internal, all that kind of stuff. Would you, I mean, okay, this is slightly pointless question, but is it still a wheel set that you prefer or recommend, or have you kind of flipped when it comes to that spec of wheel?
Short answer is yes. So those are in my top 5 of wheels for 2024, no question. Interesting enough is they're so they've kind of done updates to their other depths of that XR Ultra line of wheels, where now they're using the thicker, like the 5 mil bladed spoke. Before they were using like maybe 2 mil. And the last year's version of like the 508, which is the 58 rear, 50 front, very stiff, very. I mean, like I'm talking like those wheels, those 508s on my Propel, like 10 out of 10 stiffness. So if you want that for whatever you're riding, like you'll love it. But for the standard consumer, no way. There's no way. And so what I've kind of learned is, because now that a lot of these brands are using, I think they're called like Vonda is the manufacturer of those 5 mil bladed spokes. They're wider and maybe they are supposed to be more aerodynamic. I actually have not found them to be as stiff as the thinner carbon bladed spokes, which for 95% of the consumers, that's probably a good thing.
Yeah. You mentioned there your top 5 for 2024. Could we hear the top 5?
Sure, I'm going to try to remember all of them. So the Yolio C, the Pro C60s, they're running sales depending on when this drops. I mean, they're running sales where you can basically get those between $800 to $850 USD. They're 23 millimeter internal. You get 32 external. They're steel spokes. You get the old DT Swiss hub. They're hard to beat, and I think for someone's first foray into the Chinese world, 800 is pretty conservative versus dropping 1600 for the crafts. The DB607 machines, I like those a lot. I think that they now, especially at the price point, they have now replaced the deeper dish Winspace Hyper wheels. Difference being that they're just slightly more comfortable. The Craft Racing Works at 5060s, man, those are the ones. If I could only pick one wheel to probably run forever, it would most likely be those. They're comfortable. I like the way they look. They were kind of the first in the market as far as we know to kind of use this next generation style of hubs. They thread in. Let's see. So I still have 2 more slots, don't I?
Yeah.
The Far Sports, the Far Sports I have. I have the. You don't need the ceramic speed internals, but I have the steel spoke version of that. I like the way those were perfect match to my Propel, and that was why I specifically went with the steel spokes, was because just to round off the Propel just enough, because with 28C wheels, or excuse me, tires, you're running like 30 and a half at the rim. So they really rounded off or took the edge off of the Propel. The final one would be, um, the number 6 5058s.
Mm.
What about the envies?
Uh, they're so freaking expensive. They're three grand. I mean, they're probably, I would say they'd be number 6. I think they'd be a tie for 6 with the number 6 4550s. It would be like a close for that 6th spot. But that $3,000, I just,
Maybe we get back to the number 6, but I just want to drill into that right there. Okay. So
why?
we started off this wheel. Yes, we started off this conversation by you saying the envies are the best wheel. Then Chris says this is top 5 wheels for 2024, and you don't include the envies. So then the question is, what am I missing out on by only spending $1,000 that I'm not getting by spending $3,000 on the envies? What am I missing out on? Because if money wasn't an issue, you're still saying you should get the envies.
How do I want to answer this? Because that's a fantastic question. I think we definitely need to lean into this more. If money's no option, then I'm going to buy the wheel that I basically as much as I can spend. So I'm looking at it from just the warranty perspective, of course, obviously them being bulletproof. If the brand cachet is important to you, all those things, do any of these things actually translate to better performance? Probably not. But if money's no option, I'm just going to buy the best one.
Okay, what about this then? I'm going to try and put this to you a number of ways to try and squeeze an answer out. You join a local race team next year, and they have a wheel sponsor. And so you just get the wheels for free and you give them back at the end of the year. You got to do your fast group rides on them all year. Which ones do you pick? It's the only wheels you can ride next year.
The only wheels I can ride for all next year, strictly of just how they would fill out on the road.
Your race team is your job. The only way you make money is by getting results in your race team. So you have to choose the wheel set that you think is going to give you the highest chance of Paddy getting his arms in the air to bring home the cash at the end of the day. What are we choosing?
I'm taking the envies. Second choice, probably being the number 6 5058s.
Okay. Explain.
Sure. So the Magines, the 607s, I like them because they're, 67 rear, 60 front. It's fine where it's flat, but, unless you're doing some sort of, road race, whatever, they're probably too deep of a set of wheels. Jesse, you would have to probably chime in on that because you're running the 75s, 65s.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to do a whole mixed road season with the 75 rear wheel. It's too deep. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the first strike. So those are too deep of a wheel. The crafts, those are very comfortable. I'm just thinking about robustness of it. Again, I don't have anything tangible to have that feeling, but they're comfortable, but just as far as kind of overall stiffness. The Yolos would actually probably be a really good one because they do already support race teams. In fact, they've been supporting one of the local crit teams here in Chicagoland. So I know the support would be good. And at $800, you crash a set of wheels.
Team gives them to you for free. They got a shed full of them. Doesn't matter.
Yeah. And then what was the other ones on my list? I can't remember. The number 6, the 5058s.
Yeah, so you picked the number 6s and the envies as the two.
Yeah, so those are the two. Those are my two.
I still want to know why. Why the envies? Because if I was going to answer this now and someone said, I listened to the thing with Patrick Lino, why do you pick the envies? I'd say because he doesn't feel like they're going to snap when he hits a pothole.
No, I disagree. I think he's told us he thinks they're faster. You think they're faster, don't you?
that what you want me to say, Chris?
No, I don't know.
I don't think he has. That's why I'm asking. I'm still
Fair
not
enough.
sure. I'm not sure.
Yeah, because also for the depth, they and again, this is all marginal stuff, and so that seems to be where the price comes into play, right? Where you want these very marginal gains, and it's going to cost you that much more money. But my answer would be because they feel bomb-proof over rough pavement, something you probably want at these higher speeds. They're very stable in the crosswinds. Once you get going, they feel very, very stable.
Mm-hmm.
That's really it at that point.
But that's a
performance.
Those are kind of the
No.
key performance indicators.
Absolutely.
Like,
yeah.
That's No,
I mean, for me, in fact, if I had to pick, if I had to do an entire season, for me, I would also pick the Envies. The only situation where I'd probably steer away from, they're hookless, but I'm going to pretend they're not
That's
hookless.
The thing. Yeah.
I would, if I was doing more climbing, I would probably pick a lighter set. I'd pick the CRWs, the 50-60s. If I was doing sprints on a hilltop finish, I would probably prefer the CRWs. But that's not me. So, I think, even though I haven't ridden the Envies, I would pick them.
Yeah. But you're also got to be, like, are you going to try and contest the sprint at the top of the uphill finish? Or is that just not the day that you're going to be trying to win? Like, maybe if every single race that you did was that, but that's going to be a tiny proportion of your season, I would have thought. I just kind of think that's a real tiny use case.
Yeah, but if I'm on a team and if I'm Elliot Schultz and I'm going to get 6 results this season and they're all going to be in some kind of uphill kick climbing stage, I don't want to lug around an extra 250 grams in my wheels.
You could argue and say, well, part of the price of these Envies is the level of warranty you get. They're supporting a World Tool team, and I understand that. But I also can appreciate them saying, hey, look, we're not trying to focus on just the weight as a stat sheet. We're just trying to make bomb-proof wheels that are going to perform day in and day out for people who are actually really riding their bikes. That's an easy sell for someone, like for you guys who are competitive.
I will also say in that discussion we're having with Pat here, we're only asking out of the wheels he's ridden. I don't think the Envies are the most advanced road wheels anymore. It looks like from most of the testing, those Scope Artex have just as good as the aerodynamic properties, but they are in that Chinese carbon super light sub 1300 gram spec. So if it was it's a whole another discussion if you're starting to get into, well, pick any wheel set.
But I thought it was kind of interesting that UAE have stuck with the Envy wheels now in this new iteration of where we really care about aero and we're inventing a bike that looks like no other things, that is a spaceship. We are actually still choosing Envy. So it does feel to me that they've still maintained some speed when it comes to comparing them to other brands. But yeah, anyway. Wheels. So your wheels haven't been wobbling around when you take your hands off the bars, Pat?
No. The Craft, the 50-60s are the only ones where I had that speed wobble. I remember I was out in the countryside. I was probably, I don't know, maybe 36, 37 miles an hour descent, whatever that is in kilometers.
Yeah.
But
fast.
It was my Winspace 65s have never done that, and I've taken those wheels on that same course before, year after year. All generations of the deeper depth Winspace, I've never had that issue, but with the Crafts I have.
Can I just take a minute, because there probably be people listening right now that haven't watched our episode from a few weeks ago. So what happened was Chris was riding the new number 650 60s, 50-58s, and was able to pretty easily get into a situation where when he took his hands off the handlebars, the front wheel would just start to shake and he would just get the speed wobbles, and was able to replicate it multiple times running it on his Cervelo S5.
since then, I went back and put the reserve wheels that I originally had on the bike, and it didn't do any speed wobbles. I then put the number 6 wheels on the TCR, couldn't replicate the speed wobble.
You also put the CRW.
Getting there. I then put your CRW wheels back on the S5, which share a similar spec to the number 6s. Couldn't replicate it. Gave the number 6 wheels to my mechanic, Edwin, who runs a Cannondale Lab 71. He couldn't replicate the wobble, but his sort of quote around it was they felt unsteady at speed. And what else did I try? I then put I put them on the TCR, couldn't replicate it. And ultimately where we are in this sort of thing is I've sent that front wheel back to number 6 in Singapore for them to have a look at it. I heard people talking about, is his headset no, we've tested all that, tested all different wheel sets. I don't know, but I just there's something about that front wheel that just felt unsteady, and even when I put it back on, I couldn't get away from the fact that it had that, and you haven't experienced that, obviously.
I haven't, not on those particular set of wheel. In fact, I mean, I was out yesterday. It wasn't a super windy day, but I currently have those same number 6 wheels, Chris, on my Tavello. Now I am a bit heavier than you are, and I wonder if that plays a factor into it as well. But I've had it with the Craft 5056, but not on those wheels. So I wonder then if there is a special formula happening here where when you start to get under 1,300 grams, a lighter rider, super deep aero bike, something is happening. But then, I mean, you've tried Jesse's wheels and it didn't happen, but the wheels are also a little bit heavier.
Yeah, they are. But we had this chat. I wish I could be more descriptive. Some of the language you've used so far today, I'm going to steal some of it the way you describe some of your riding experience because it's really good. But I still can't get away from the fact, especially I regard myself I actually regard myself as pretty good in crosswinds. Like I actually find I ride quite well, and I'm very used to it, and I'm very used to being a rider who suffers from it just because of where we live and my size and everything. I had to get good at it, and I do feel myself good at it. And I'd actually had in our show notes for ages, riding in crosswinds as an issue is dead, just because I got so used to how well the reserve wheels, the wide tires, just how planted on the road I would feel. In fact, there were certain times where I just felt like the bike was almost sailing along in crosswinds, that it was potentially even a performance advantage. And putting those carbon spoke wheels back on, and this included Jesse's CRWs, I felt like, oh shit, no, I remember this. I hate this feeling in crosswinds, that it was that kind of, it's blowing at you and you're kind of, is it coming? Oh, there it is. Got it. Okay. Just fight back a bit. There we go. Okay. And I'd totally forgotten that was a thing. And you said even you'd noticed jumping on my wheels that you felt that was more stable.
Yeah. Putting the reserves on, which were the same depth, it wasn't a massive difference. But it was noticeably more stable in crosswinds. Yeah, that you feel the wind coming. You're waiting for the jerk, and which you have to resist. Didn't really come as much. It wasn't a huge difference, but it was definitely noticeable. But that brings up the question of, well, the reserves are heavier, and then so what? The discussion that we are going to probably continue pressing next year is this question of, okay, you've got the ability to make a 60 mil deep wheel set that weighs sub 1,300 grams, but is that just too light? Are you actually just losing out at that stage? And then what is the sweet spot for wheel set weight? Because, sorry, I'm just going to keep going with this one. Where this actually led me was, if it is true that the heavier wheels are just more stable in crosswinds and are just better in those scenarios. Well, why don't we have why don't we go back to 2 kilogram wheel sets? Why don't we add some weight to the rims? If there's a performance gain in those situations going from 1250 to 15, why don't we go from 15 to 1750? I just have so many questions.
But haven't we seen that in triathlon? Like, triathlon wheel weights haven't dropped. They've stayed big and heavy. That's what from anecdotally, maybe I need to do a little bit more research than that.
Those zip discs are like 900 grams. The tri-spokes are quite light. Well, track wheels have gotten lighter. Track bikes have gotten lighter.
I'm still not over the envy question. I'm gonna lose sleep over this. You know why?
We got time. Feel free to just bother and be like, look, I got one more to add to that one specific question.
You know, why would I pick the envies over all those other ones? And now, from what you're saying, Jesse, is if I'm saying, oh, they just feel bomb proof and they are a little bit heavier, right? So they inherently should be better in the crosswinds. Then Yolio could just make a wheel that's also 1,500 grams for the similar depth, and that should solve that problem. And then it goes back to, why would I want to spend $3,000 for a similar spec wheel? Then the answer becomes like, probably not anymore at that point.
That's it.
It's your fault. He's done this.
Here's experiments that I'd love to do. Like, let's get Chris.
Hang on, you've already got me doing a 20-minute bloody FTP test. I'm not doing another one.
You're the guinea pig. Oh, this is what happens when we go down these rabbit holes. Let's get Chris can we somehow lace up a CRW that weighs 1,700 grams and see if you go, yeah, look, this just holds its speed well.
Oh, and,
yeah.
And then try and match the specs with like a 1,100 gram wheel set with the same depth. Yeah, interesting.
Like it isn't, but that is, isn't it? If you've got a less rotating mass, it's not as stable.
I mean, you can't cheat the physics or the engineering. So I mean, you can only make it so light to where you most likely are removing carbon somewhere, and you hope that it's not being removed in places where you're gonna snap your collarbone.
There's a one for you, Chris. So you put the number 6 wheels on the TCR. How many rides did you do on that? That was only the front wheel, wasn't it?
No, I did both.
It doesn't have a Shimano free hub?
Yeah, I had the one in the box.
Oh, right, okay. Well, there's an interesting comparison between the Cadex and the number 6. Did you get anything from that comparison? Were the Cadexes more stable crosswind-wise? Because they're also light and carbon spokes.
Yeah, good question. I actually thought the Cadexes were faster. And it went against everything. Sorry to just derail this, by the way. So they're like a 22 mil internal, 40 mil deep, 28 mil tire, and on the TCR, it gave me the sensation on the TCR that I want, which is that absolute snappiness. But it did definitely feel like I wasn't losing that much speed. And I was only gaining I was gaining sort of 10 mil front and rear. I actually much preferred the way that the Cadexes rode on there. I think it's a combination of the width that the amount of surface area that we've created with this deep wheel, and it being so light that it does change the way the bike rides.
I'm just going to read a comment from when we spoke about that on the NERO show a few weeks ago. Someone that replied with a comment I thought was interesting. It kind of aligns with what you were saying, Pat. About speed wobbles. I had a similar issue with an SL8 and Roval Rapide CLX1s. The bike came with turbo Conti tires, 26 mil. I have changed the wheels to the CRW 5060s with 30 mil GP 5000s, and the wobbling completely disappeared. Then the seat post was too flexible, not related to the wobble. So I bought the Daramo seat post and have asked for the reinforced one despite not being overweight. Today, coming back to the Rapide CL1s with the 30 mil tires, the wobbling is no longer there. The speed wobbles come from a resonance of the complete bike system. So to solve it, you have to change an element to a more flexible or a more rigid one. This is not necessarily the carbon spokes. I guess one should change in order of cheap to most expensive. The tire, the seat post, then the frame. Sorry, then the wheels, then the frame.
That's
so it's a bit of a black magic.
I had people talking about frequencies. Cervelo people telling me that could be a frequency issue with the way that the front wheel marries with the bike. It's a rabbit hole that's above my pay grade.
But do you think for these brands, when they're designing their frame sets, that they have a certain wheel depth in mind, like a sweet spot?
They have a wheel in mind. And you're going to see that more and more. Like Cervelo now will basically just say they're coming with reserve wheels. Full stop. And that's anything else you put on the bike, good luck.
Because I had those same craft wheels on my SL8, same roads, same winds, totally fine. But on the Cervelo Attack, the first Cervelo frame, and the Propel, I got the speed wobbles.
Just on the wheels in general, given how many different avenues there are and weights and spokes, there's just a lot of work to be about. I feel like they're still relatively early on, and like people think, carbon wheels have hit their peak, they're all done with. I don't think so. Like, if you look at the top performing wheels, one of them is the Synchros Capital SLs with super deep bonded in carbon spokes, and then not far behind you've got heavy Envies with a thin steel spoke. Like, they're very different. I suggest that there's going to be more development in this space.
Gentlemen, what is your thoughts about tires or tire width? Jesse, you're running, are you running 30 and 32s?
Depending on the rim, I like to have a measured width on the rear of about 33 and about 31 on the front. And so actually on most modern rims, I'm actually running a 28 on the front that gets me into that 30, 31 measured, and usually a 32 on the rear.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. And I bring this up because just as you're saying, there's a lot more work to do with the wheels as far as carbon spokes and just overall design. I don't think less weight and wider internal width, I don't think those are the end all to wheels. Like my sweet spot is like 23, 24 millimeter internal. We start getting to 25, 26, and then you have to go up to 30C Conti's on there. I don't like the way that feels out on the road. I like to be at that like 30, 31 myself. That seems to be the sweet spot for enough firmness, but smooths out a little bit of those rough edges on the pavement.
That's where we're different though, Pat, because I just want the smoothest possible ride. Give me max compliance. For the fastest speed, I want the most compliance. I don't really ever think I would make a choice to purposefully have less compliance to get more road feedback. For me, I just want to be as comfortable as possible. But then also still be fast. Like I'm still not putting a 32 tire on the front rims, because on modern rims, that's then 33, 34 measured, and I just do not think aerodynamically that's as good as a 31 measured.
This is a great point, because this really highlights the difference of where we are at, myself versus you two, when it comes to like how we ride our bikes. You could argue, someone say, I like manual transmission because I like to clunk through the gears. The guy who's racing says, look, I want that sequential shifter because all I care about is being able to shift as quickly as possible because I'm trying to win a race. And I think this is kind of one of those things that kind of falls into that, is I'm used to that stiffness. So that's what I like, but we've learned that it's not faster.
But we know, in fact, we rode with a guy not that long ago who's a racer, but he loves that I feel like my bike's beating me up feeling. Like that was, to him, that's what being a racer is like harsh, horrible, horrific, like pain. So he's just like, yeah, give me stiffer and that. So you're dead right. Like it's becoming more. But just quickly on the internal width. So I've been I'm going to mention the G word, gravel, real quick. So I have been running those Zip Explore 32 mil internal wheels on the gravel bike recently, and it's a bizarre sensation. So I've got 45 mil tires on there, and they line up perfectly like you would have on a road bike because the internal width is so weird. And I'm running like 26 PSI and doing a couple of like road days riding at sort of 30 kilometers an hour with 26 PSI in my tires, just riding endurance around the place. Like it's bananas. And it felt like riding on I insert like absolute stereotypical comment here about cloud or something like that. I mean, obviously that's not what it's designed for. It's designed to ride on gravel, but I think you're going to see some pretty wild releases this year to play into this.
Have you had any issues with tire side cuts? And the reason why I bring this up is because when Zip initially released those wheels, you know, they came with the matching. Who made them?
I'm going to say Goodyear. I think Goodyear.
I think it was Goodyear, and customers were reporting a lot of side cuts because, all right, I'm not an engineer here, but here we go. The tire was not wide enough. The tire wasn't wide enough, so it was exposing too much of the sidewalls because of how wide that internal width was.
That makes perfect sense. I can totally see why that would happen. My tires were wide enough. I did check that going in. But yeah, 100%. I can see why that would be an issue.
I've got another gripe. If we come back to the internal width split on the road, and you've probably seen this, I don't know if you have an opinion on it, but the Chinese wheels seem to do it a lot, where they keep making the front rim wider and the rear rim narrower. Now, Reserve do it, but there's only a 1 mil difference between the front and rear, internal and external. But the CRWs, for example, the front is a 34 external and a 25 internal, and the rear is only a 29 external and a 21 internal. And it just creates a problem because I'm having to use a wider tire on the rear to get the width I want, and then I'm limited in the width I can use on the front because as soon as I put a 30 on or a 32, the thing just gets so wide, it's like a gravel tire. And so that is a gripe I have. Ideally, they should just make the correct width rims so that you can just run 30 front, 30 rear, and it all lines up perfectly. A purposefully narrow rear wheel, I just don't get. Aside from it, maybe it's a bit lighter, but probably not that much.
My thought process behind it, or at least what they're probably thinking, is having the rear wheel more narrow maybe gives that sensation that they're stiff, but it doesn't really make sense to me. I'm on board of just having the internal and external be the same for both the front and rear. Not to mention it creates problems of what tire pressure am I going to run, because it gets kind of messed up that way too. And also too is, I think for the crafts, why they are so comfortable is because that front tire is so comfortable. But I don't necessarily like that squishy feel when you're out of the saddle that comes with the wider wheel. So at the back, it's fine, but because like you said, that front tire ends up being so large, the back is stiffer than the front end of the bike.
Could it be a more practical reason? I noticed when I put your CRWs on, no, it was the number 6s, I think, that the tire same tire, just nicked the front derailleur when it was in the small ring. And so to have a narrower rear internal width makes that a slightly narrower fit and less chance of that.
Yeah, but it's the kind
hitting.
of opposite, because if it was on the CRWs, I have a 32 on the rear because I want that width. If they just made the rim wider, I could have a 30 mil tire, which is a lighter tire, and it would flow with the rim better, which is potentially a little bit more comfortable, or just the way that it's meant to be. Yeah, no,
Unless maybe it's just for stability too. Maybe just having again, it's Peak Torque is going to ream me for this, but larger tire contact patch to the road with a wider tire should help with stability. But then the question becomes, why don't they just do that?
Can I hit you with just a couple of quick one-word answers?
Let's do it.
Steel spokes or carbon spokes?
Carbon.
Aero bike, do it all.
Just-
Yeah, I know. Aero bike, do-it-all bike or sub 6.6 kilo climbing bike?
Oh, Aero for sure. No question.
If you could get the envies with carbon spokes, would you do it?
Make sure you zoom in at Jesse's face of just the level of disappointment.
It's going to get worse.
Carbon spokes.
Yeah.
I'm just confused more than anything. I meant that as a serious question. If you could get the envies with carbon spokes, would you do it? I bet
yeah, for sure.
Oh, you would?
100%.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
okay.
Tubeless or tubes?
Oh, tubes for sure.
Why are we even talking to this guy? Does indoors Zwift or go outside and get wet? Or neither?
Indoors Zwift for sure. 100%.
Hookless or hooks?
Oh. Sorry, Jesse. Hooked for sure.
Nice. What else have I got? Tade or Jonas?
Jonas, and I'm going to tell you why really quickly. So as the middle child in my family, where I kind of was left to my own devices, and I've always just kind of been never really been like the leader. I've just kind of been off doing my own thing. So when he won that mountain stage on the tour this year, and he got emotional, like I got emotional because I understood in that moment what it feels like to not be the top dog and to kind of feel like you've been counted out. And yeah, he may not be the most exciting guy to watch because he's not always counterattacking Tade, but I connected with him the most in that moment because that's exactly how I feel, especially like in some of my rides out this way where everyone is so freaking strong now, and I'm like, man, this kind of sucks. And it's like, hey, every dog has his day, and so that was his day. So yeah, I gotta go with Jonas.
I reckon there's a shift happening. I reckon there's a groundswell of support for Jonas happening 2020.
Personally, I just like the kind of under wraps run and he does. He just picks a select few races and you don't really want to know what you get at the Tour de France. I find that's a more interesting story, the way he runs into it. I like that. It just makes the tour a better event.
You become a hero long enough to see yourself become a villain. We hope that does not happen with Podgy.
Custom build versus stock builds.
Custom builds. And this kind of goes back to the whole middle child syndrome thing. Is I don't like not having control over what I ride and how I kind of carry about my day and do things. And the idea of riding anything stock, especially for what you pay, even if it is the best, just doesn't resonate with me because I'd like to be a little bit more unique. And I think there are gains to be had if you go the custom route.
So if you were going to do a custom build then, and feel free to venture out into things that you haven't ridden that you maybe just you think are good, you like the look of, what bike would you build? 2025. Team bike. That local team of yours, that imaginary local team's going, Paddy, we're going to approach the brands.
If we're saying, hey, there's no price, there's no price limit, I'm going, again, and I'm not worried about resale value or anything, I'm going Scott foil with those envies. DI2 for sure. Sorry, SRAM folks. SRAM's folks, their headquarters is here. I'm going DI2 for sure. Galfer rotors because I like those. Saddle Italia, NERO saddle, and probably just like 140 mil cockpit if Synchros makes such a thing. But that would be my setup, and I would be straight for a solid year or more. I'd quit YouTube.
That's funny. So given that you haven't ridden it, what's attracted you to the Scott foil? Is there a spec thing or just a mystique? You like the look of it?
I love the way it looks, which is why I got the tan. Oh yeah, I love the way it looks. It's just unique in a sea of do it all bikes. It looks so deliberate. Like, hey, we're not trying to be a climbing bike at all. We just want to look as fast as possible on it. I like the paint jobs that they offer. And yeah, those just really it. I think it's just a unique bike. I have not seen a single one here in Chicago. So that's also like a huge plus for me because it becomes a great conversation to have. Someone here has a Ribble, that 2 or 3 year old Ribble SLR thing looks wild out in the wild. So some things like that kind of catch my eye, or not kind of, they really catch my eye. No one has Propel here, so that's another reason why too.
And just on a similar thing, what if you had to redo the same, but I'm not going to give a price limit, but just with budget in mind? What would you change?
What would I change? The setup I have now, which would be the Tavello Aero with the number 6 50/58 wheels.
Okay.
That'd be the way to go.
Does any part of you, so I've been on this little crusade recently. Well, it's not I'll be up my bonnet about this with the spec builds. That, okay, this is all good and well that you're sitting around a table and going, oh no, I'd like 22 mil internal. No, actually, I'll add a spoke here. And because you can go right into it and really break down your bike any way you want. But at any point, do you think that you've started to make the bike ride worse? And the flip side of that then being, okay, well, mainstream stock man has this build. We know how it rides. If you start tinkering with it, you're actually subtracting from what the bike is.
No, the only exception I would say would be like the S-Works SL8 with the Revol CLX2s. Those are really the only wheels that make sense to me. But all the other stock builds with stock wheels, they're not coming anywhere close to the Chinese brands.
So you think it's bullshit? Well, essentially, like that you have to buy the package. Like you have to get the giant Propel with the Cadex wheels and the Cadex handlebars because that's the way it's been designed. You think, no, fuck that. I know how to make this Propel ride better. I will put these, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because my suspicion is, if you think about some of these world tour teams, they're riding like Dura-Ace wheels, or like Astana's riding like Vision Metron. It's easy for us, the online folks, to say, well, why don't they just go to CRW or Yolio and just get a proper set of wheels? And you figure they have to have spares for however many bikes and all, everything that comes with it. So for these Western brands, they're selling thousands upon thousands of bikes, so they just need these wheels to be at a specific spec for it to make sense. So I think there's gains left on the table by just going or sticking with the stock wheels.
I guess that's probably more just the way you build your bikes too. Is you don't get access to a lot of stock builds because you're generally getting frame sets and custom building anyway. Yeah, like the giant Propel, that was a frame set. You didn't get to ride it with the Cadex, the giant wheels.
With the Polygon build, because the complete bike was sent to me, I had to make sure to tread lightly with reaching back out to them and say, hey, I want to make these changes, because in order for me to give an honest review of it, it needs to be similarly spec to what I'm used to. But now, you're basically telling the audience like, hey, this bike is much better if you dump the stock wheels.
What do you want to do more riding of then? Do you want to test the new Trek Madone? Or do you want to go test Seeker Spear? Where's your curiosity lie?
I mentioned in a recent video that I was interested in the Factor Astro. And just for different reasons, I'm like, maybe not so much, because I think I'm getting to the point where it does become more difficult to really tell the differences between these frames. And it just kind of becomes, oh, this bike is incredible. And it's like, okay, well, how much better or worse is it? And so it becomes hard, especially because for these premium brands, I'm having to pay for it myself. But I do like that frame. It's not super unique, but I like the way it looks. The Seika Spear is also on the list, but I haven't had any contact with them, nor have I reached out to them. It seems like those frames are pretty difficult to get. I really do like the Scott foil. It's just the resale would be it'd be difficult because it's such a specific frame. I'm planning on doing a lot more gravel. I didn't do any gravel at all last year. So coincidentally, the frame behind me that I'm building is a Tan gravel bike. Uh, pretty unique looking frame. But the
Maybe.
goal is to get into more gravel.
Oh,
Yes.
Here we go.
Yes.
that'll be the death of your channel.
No. Fantastic. Let's see.
Let's
How
go.
like how a gravel bike rides?
Yeah,
You've got 50 mil tires.
Yeah.
Like it.
I'll agree with
Like
that.
what is there really to get into?
Though it is an interesting. I don't know about you, Pat, but like that space, like the gravel bike ride reviews stuff. That's I think where the specs play even more of a role, rather dominate the conversation over the riding of it. It's like, what's the tire clearance? Is it UDH compatible? Has it got storage? You know, all this kind of functionality chat, rather than us diving deep into the rear end compliance of a bike.
Yeah, I like, so the wheels I have paired to this gravel bike, I got them from Nine Velo. I think Peak Torque speaks pretty highly of Nine Velo, but the gravel wheels. So, kind of jotting down my notes on what I'm going to say. To you guys' point, I'm thinking like, yeah, what am I going to say? Because they're going to have like 40 plus mil tires on there. So I can't use my usual metrics. It's basically just do they work or not?
Yep.
At that point.
Yeah. That's and get your tire pressure right. Like that's literally what I've sort of found in the last. That sort of brings me. I actually am interested. Like, so you don't race on the road anymore. Is there a reason why, or maybe you didn't? Just doesn't interest you because you clearly like still ride a heap and like fast.
So at a high level, I'm just not good at it, to be honest. I'm just not very good, and I haven't done enough of it to get past the nervousness of it.
Yep.
So crashing does scare me. And how I got into cycling was, it's funny. So before the pandemic, my wife and I, for our anniversary, we would take some like crazy trip somewhere around the globe for a couple of weeks at a time. So we had this like long 2-week trip across the country, across the world rather. I fully ruptured my Achilles heel the night before we were supposed to hop on our flight. And I was in a cast, like a foot cast for like a month and a half, had to get surgery. I was going full sprint down the court. I was playing a lot of league basketball at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Full sprint down to the other side of the court, went to jump up, heard a pop, didn't even think anything of it. Yeah. It didn't even hurt at the time. And I remember my teammate saying, "I think you ruptured your Achilles." And all I said was, "I'm supposed to be on a flight in 12 hours. What am I going to do?" So that fear and PTSD is a real thing for crashing for me. And, I have, of course, my family, my friends who depend on me on a regular basis. And it's hard to do the YouTube thing with a broken collarbone.
So it's a big safety thing. Does that follow up then just onto the cycling scene in Chicago? Is it a lot of like town center crit type stuff? Is that what dominates the racing scene?
No, we don't really have too many of those anymore. A lot of them are just in various towns around Chicagoland. So of course, Intelligentsia, or formerly Intelligentsia, which is now Chicago Grit, arguably probably the largest series of crit racing in the country, and so they take place in the different cities. So that's very popular. But up until that point in the season, which is normally like June through July, if you want to do any sort of crit racing, you kind of have to go out of state. Maybe like a 2-3 hour drive.
And is gravel starting to fill that void? Like, are you seeing more gravel events come online?
Yeah. So there's a lot of fantastic gravel series. So the one that I do, it's called Rough Road 100. It's 100K long. It's about 60% road, 40% rough road, and then the final, say like the final 30 minutes is just like this kind of muddy trail section. So your choice of frame and tires becomes critical, I would say. So that one is the beginning of April every year. So that's kind of the one where people kind of either, if you're on the recreational side of things, that's your A race. You do that, and then we don't see you again until like July. Or if you are a dedicated racer, that's your warm up race where everyone comes out for that one. And that kind of begins the race season. So for the gravel, yeah, there are some really good gravel events. It's just you have to drive like 2 or 3 hours outside the city. There isn't anything local. Can I ask you guys, how old were you each when you got into crit racing? Because I'm just trying to think for myself, coming off that injury, being older now, and realizing my mortality, maybe I might feel differently if I got into it younger.
I was pretty old. Yeah, because I was cricket, rugby, skiing, like they were my sports, and I only started riding in my early 30s and didn't pin a number on for the first time until I think I was 32, 33. It was the first time I actually raced. But I don't know whether it's just here, but we have a really good way to get into racing in this country, that you have this really basic level of club racing, which can often be like 6 people on a designated crit track. And that's just what you do. And then you just slowly progress through, and next minute you're doing a race with 80 other people.
I've also never had a bad crash. I've been racing for the last probably 8 years. So I started when I was 22, 23. And the worst crash I've had is just maybe one broken rib or badly bruised rib. That's it. So I don't actually think, obviously people have worse luck, but for me, racing isn't dangerous.
I wonder too is, because I fall into the category of getting into cycling during the pandemic and spending 6 months out the year on Zwift, where the fitness might be there, but the bike handling, like there's no way, as opposed to maybe in other areas like California or in Florida where you're outdoors all year. So I wonder if that plays a part into it too. Maybe the culture is different where you guys are at here. Maybe it's just how people are dynamically out in these groups are different. I'm just trying to think what would have to change in my end for me to get back into it, fitness aside. Obviously there's some risk. I don't think I also have the mental fortitude of just like, hey, if you want to be competitive, you're going to have to take a little bit of risk.
I don't know. It sounds like you've got a competitive sport background, though. This is not like you've just come in off the couch and you're like never done competitive sport. Like you played like league basketball. So clearly you want to win when you're playing that. And I honestly don't think the leap is that big from jumping on a bike and being in a race. Next minute you're like, oh no, I want to win. Like it's a...
But aren't your group rides fairly fast? Race adjacent speeds?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've gone back and forth on this group ride topic several times, and most recently it's been because of just talking to the actual legitimate racer folks in Chicago of what their take about these faster group rides. So for someone like myself, right, it's the end all be all, right? It's like, oh, I'm sprinting for the town line sprint against someone, he's a cat 1. So obviously we must be the same. And it's like, and they're saying we're not, this is just a warm up for us. So I've been trying to have better perspective on it, but it is a lot of fun, and the camaraderie, it's bar none.
But if you're doing that, that's a race. I mean, that's essentially what a race is. It's just that a race is on a probably slightly more technical circuit where there's more corners, and generally the field will probably be a little bit more confident and will be a little more tightly packed than you might get on a group ride. But if you're sprinting for town signs in a fast-paced group ride, that's a very small step to actually just pinning a number on.
So what you're saying then is, Pat, you're doing this on the weekend anyways. There's no difference between...
You're just not doing it officially.
Yeah.
I mean, I do feel comfortable in those groups at this point. Makes a good point. I'll be interested to see what the comments are on this topic of, does being in these type of environments on the road translate well to getting into racing?
And there's certain types of races. I mean, I'm like this, and you know that. Like, I hate the bar to bar. I hate it. Like, I just bail out. So that's like when people are right next to you and you're hooking bars with each other, and it's just you going at 50, 60 Ks an hour, and that's what I just tend to I'm the first person to be touching the brakes, and I'm basically out there. So when it comes to that type of race or that style of race, I just don't do it. Like, I just don't do it. So I end up doing races that are really hard, and so hard races tend to therefore be less bar to bar because everyone's on the limit and you're either in single file or you're in smaller groups or blah, 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 blah. Or you race a way that maybe you become like a breakaway rider. So that's the type of person that just, the last thing I want to do is be back in that peloton. So I'm going to bust my gut to be in a breakaway. And if that doesn't work, then I'm out the back door.
And the one race that I do every year in April, I absolutely love that one. That's like the one I train for the most, and that's normally when my fitness is at its peak in April. Because, like you said, Chris, you're not trying to go into a corner with 60 people. It's a lot more spread out. It's a road race, so you're gonna find your smaller take group to go with, and you feel a lot more comfortable. You're not locking bars, as you mentioned. So all those little things add up to me to it just ends up being a more enjoyable and perceivably safer place to still be competitive.
Does the Fondo exist in Chicago? The sort of competitive Fondo type thing?
Not in Chicago, and I wish there were because that would be my jam.
Yeah.
So we have this one race. It's like maybe a 3-hour drive in the next state up in Wisconsin, but it's called Race Around the Lake, and I believe it's about 90 miles. There's just a large lake. They race around it, but they start off in different heats. So you kind of have to decide yourself and be honest which heat you belong in. But what ends up happening is some of the slower heats will end up catching the faster heats. But then I've also heard from people where they'll say, like, unless you are really at the front of that group making moves, you're basically just sitting in at, 45K an hour for, 4 hours.
All right, I reckon we wrap it up. What do you reckon, guys? Thank you so much for your time, Pat. Yeah, really appreciate your time. Happy New Year.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Happy to have been on. Thank you for the invitation. Shout out to all my Chicago peeps. I won't say any names because if I say 2, I have to say like 20. So I won't say 1. But thanks for having me on.
Legend.
Thanks,
anytime.
Pat.